Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a meeting for students and faculty of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. The culture war and cancel culture debate takes place at the intersection of race and ethnicity, ideology, identity, and substance, at a time when the political middle, where things used to get done in this country, has been hollowed out by technological advances that leave so many of us mired in our self-reinforcing silos. When we can't even agree on facts, how do we agree to move forward? It has spawned a strange rash of grievance politics, political correctness, and whataboutism, where, for example, criticism of the January 6th insurrectionist attack on the US Capitol is equated with Black Lives Matter protests the summer before. Even Dr. Seuss's family's decision to withdraw some of his books because of what they considered racist imagery became one more front in the battle. And let's not get started on the degendering of Mr. Potato Head. Academia on elite private campuses, but at public universities as well, has not been immune to these pressures, where leftist students try to block right-wing speakers and vice versa, though to a lesser degree. The movement to create so-called safe spaces for students to feel free from what they call attacks on their identity and security is widespread. So many seemingly ancillary issues get pigeonholed into preconceived senses of intersectionality that it is exhausting to have to back out enough to find a common ground. The genesis of the show tonight is a story by New York Times writer Michael Powell, my former colleague at New York Newsday, who wrote about the complicated array of factors that played out at Smith College, where a student, the daughter of African immigrants, claimed she felt racially profiled when asked by a white maintenance worker to leave a closed area. Michael joins us tonight to discuss the story and the issues of free speech more generally, as do a distinguished panel of academics from across the country. Keith Whittington is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University and an organizer of the recently formed Academic Freedom Alliance, which set at its goal protecting free speech for all on campus. Susan Brysons is the Eunice and Julian Cohen Professor for the Study of Ethics and Human Values in Dartmouth College's Department of Philosophy. Christopher Edley is a professor of law and a former dean of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And I graduated from Brooklyn College, but I won't hold that against him. With this distinguished academic panel, let me start with Professor Powell. Michael, set the stage about the Smith College situation. What drew you to it? What were the complications?
Yeah, hi, Bob. Thanks. I started off because I had actually followed this a couple of years ago when this had happened, and it seemed to present one narrative at that time and a different narrative a few years later. And I mean, the narrative at first was one I think very familiar to any of us the last few years. A young student sees herself as being identified as, in this case, as she put it, eating while black or being black, and was profiled by, as she saw it, white workers on campus. The university later did called in an investigative firm and looked at it. And I should say, when this first happened, what happened? She'd gone into, I mean, it's workaday. It's not like no one committed a felony of any kind here. She was working during the summer. She went into a cafeteria that students who were working during the summer were actually not supposed to use because it was set aside for a summer camp. They let her, she got her food. She went into a dorm that also had been closed for the summer and sat in a lounge. She wasn't doing anything other than, scrolling through her phone. At the same time, a janitor sees her. The janitors have been told by security and by the university, keep a close eye during the summer because, of course, Smith, as is true of many universities in the summer, is an underpopulated place. So they want to make sure that you don't have people coming in from the outside, particularly into abandoned parts of buildings. And they were also told, by and large, security told them this, don't, unless you're very comfortable, don't confront the person on your own. Simply call security. Security has much more experience in this than you do. So you have this 35-year-old, or I'm sorry, you had a janitor of 35 years work at the university. An older man sees this. Actually, I shouldn't say an older man, given my own age. A young man. He sees somebody there. He decides, okay, let me just call security. He calls security. At no point in his call to security does he identify the person as Black, although he did in fact see what he thought was, a Black, that she was Black, that he saw her leg. And he just simply says, there's somebody there. I don't know what it's about. They send over security cop, unarmed, who immediately recognizes her as a student. They have a polite, the student records the conversation. They have a polite conversation on both sides, and that's it. In fact, I'm pretty sure she didn't even actually leave the lounge at that time. She left presumably some minutes later. Later that night, she goes on Facebook and says that she's been profiled, that this was a racial, to her view, a racial incident. The university, I think it's fair to say, kind of falls over itself in apologizing to her. The next few days are taken up by a series of pretty profuse apologies, and also an assumption, I think it's fair to say, if you look at the language that the university was using, that she had in fact been profiled. They had never talked to the employees. A later investigative report some many months later comes out and says, well, in fact, several of the employees who she had fingered as being responsible, in fact, were not, well, one of them was not even working that day. Another of them had absolutely nothing to do with it, and that there was no evidence that the janitor was involved. So anyway, it goes forward, but at the same time, it becomes quite a morality play. And I don't mean that dismissively, but on campus. I mean, students are walking out of convocation in the beginning of the fall in solidarity with this student. There's a whole series of trainings that are being put in place. Some of those that these employees will later go through are, fairly quite a bit in depth. I mean, where they're supposed to kind of plumb their own racial feelings and this sort of thing. That's where it goes, and that's where I wrote about it.
Keith, at Princeton, by the way, I got a graduate degree at Rutgers, which is 17 miles up the road from Princeton. I was never sure if that fence around Princeton was designed to keep them out or to keep people in, but that's a separate point. These kinds of situations happen at private universities, particularly Ivy League elite universities, quite often, or at least maybe it's those schools that get the attention. Is it that kind of saga, for want of a better word, that drove you in part to form the Academic Freedom Alliance?
I certainly think you're right that these kinds of events happen. They often get publicized when they're at very elite colleges. I suspect they're more common than that, and that they happen to other kinds of institutions as well. I wouldn't say that those kind of events, though, are really the drivers for the desire to form the Academic Freedom Alliance. I think there's been lots of faculty across the country over the last several years who've observed more and more pressure on their ability to teach classes as they understand it. There's pressure on their scholarship and whether or not they can investigate critical and controversial subject matters. There's increasing pressure on people for things they say in public, whether it's on social media and other contexts, when they might say something that's controversial or inflammatory that can then set off sometimes students, but also set off outside activists who are paying attention to these things and what faculty say. In all these contexts, then you wind up with pressure being put on campus administrators to suspend or dismiss or otherwise sanction the faculty for things they say. So the Academic Freedom Alliance is really designed to stand up for faculty's free speech and academic freedom rights and protect them against campus administrators who might be tempted to want to throw them under the bus in the case of one of these controversies.
Susan, free speech is I always thought that the answer to bad speech is more speech. But you think it's a little bit more complicated than that, that there's an element in which speech can cause harm. And so to some degree, for want of a better word, it could be limited.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of different issues that are being raised. I mean, first, I want to say the issue of academic freedom is in significant ways distinct from the question of free speech, but sometimes these things get blurred together. I mean, in the US, under the First Amendment, free speech, the right to free speech, simply limits what the government can do, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, private non-state actors can do whatever they want. They can kick Donald Trump off Twitter. They can, restrict all sorts of speech. But since you asked this question about the response to speech, that's harmful, I think it's important, first of all, to acknowledge that speech does harm. And I sometimes have arguments with some of my colleagues who are loath to acknowledge that. But I think now we all recognize this, especially after the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, that was sparked by speech, right? And no one thinks, that speech has no effects. I mean, the very fact that we teach kids, the pen is mightier than the sword, we think speech is enormously powerful. And I think that an argument needs to be given, and I haven't seen it, if your view is that speech can only be a force for good and not a force for evil or ill. Speech does harm. In spite of the sticks and stones mantra, we all acknowledge that. And then the question is how to respond to it. I'm very influenced by critical race theorists who in the 80s and 90s talked about just how racist speech can harm. Some of it is like a slap in the face. If it's assaultive, causes immediate harm. That's in some cases not that different from the harm that comes from a physical assault. Same post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. In sexual harassment law, we acknowledge that some speech creates a hostile environment, right? That employees have a right to be protected from. The Smith case is interesting, and it shows how the internet really complicates all of this. I mean, I had real sympathy for many of these people. I mean, the cafeteria worker, Ms. Blair, who didn't do anything wrong, was attacked, was contacted by various media outlets. There were posts on Facebook about her that she was the racist or a racist. How is more speech her response to the way that she was harmed to that speech? Yet she doesn't have access to the same media outlets. She doesn't have 1 million Twitter followers. I mean, she's not even on Twitter, as far as I can tell. So I think we have to look at the context in which speech is being uttered. And I know lots of people refer to John Stuart Mill, who has this famous argument from Truth in his book on liberty. But even he says, look, speech isn't always protected. His example is an opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor or that private property is robbery ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the home of a corn dealer, or when handed about among that same mob in the form of a placard. So in that kind of case, there isn't time, right, for more speech to address the harm, the threat that's coming from the speech in question.
Chris, the First Amendment applies differently at public universities than it does at private universities, as I understand it. I mean, the degree to which Twitter and Facebook are not as subject. You could argue that they're common carriers and there should be some public obligations that go along with that. But you had a situation at Berkeley with John Yoo. John Yoo is a member of the faculty, was the author of the torture memos under President George W. Bush. You had people who wanted to run him out of the school. I know your politics. You could not disagree with John Yoo more in terms of his politics, but you felt obligated to say, no, you know, we're not going to run him out of the school. Is that a fair reading of the case?
It is. We might want to unpack that a little bit for your students, since I hate to tell you this, Bob, but it really is kind of ancient history. So the situation was that John Yoo was a tenured member of the law school faculty at Berkeley. He took a leave of absence from the university in the early 2000s to serve in the Justice Department under President George W. Bush. And in that capacity, in the Justice Department, he wrote a couple of memoranda that addressed the question of whether or not the so-called enhanced interrogation methods that United States soldiers and intelligence officers were using against suspected terrorists, the question of whether those enhanced interrogation methods violated United States and international laws against torture. And his conclusion was that they did not, and that became the legal guidance for the activities of the executive branch going forward. When those memoranda came to light, there was a lot of disagreement about them, and a strong view, I would say a majority view, that John was giving too much latitude to the military and the intelligence community to do interrogations, that his definition of terror was too narrow, and that these acts some of these acts had been illegal. The question for me, I was the incoming dean of the law school at that point, was how to respond to questions from alumni, demonstrations from students, a lot of demonstrations from undertaken by interested groups outside of the university who wanted Professor Yoo to be dismissed because of these memoranda or otherwise sanctioned. There are a couple of things that are distinctive about this circumstance, and I think Keith and Susan in particular would appreciate all of this. One is the memos were written while he was on leave from the university, acting in his personal capacity on leave as a government official. Number two, I believed, and of course I was correct, that there are divided opinions about the definition of torture. And in my judgment, at least 3, probably 4, maybe 5 justices on the 9-member Supreme Court of the United States would have agreed with John, so that the actual legal position that he took, however objectionable to me and others, was not way outside the mainstream to an extent that it would, in some important way, injure the university's reputation or the functioning of the university in any way whatsoever. And number 3, if how he acted on his own time while on leave was just an awful example of lawyering, that really wasn't up to the university to decide. That's why we have state bar associations to decide if somebody has committed malpractice or otherwise been inequitable. I mean, the university just isn't in a position to adjudicate that kind of an issue. The most gratifying part, if I can find any silver lining in that for me, was that I spoke to the law community about all of this, and the students were, I think, almost universally supportive. He was a very effective teacher. They benefited from his point of view, being different from the points of view of 90%, 95% of the faculty. He was respectful of students who disagreed with him in class, bent over backwards to make sure that everybody felt empowered to take different points of view. and argue them cogently. That's what law school is about. It's about learning how to think critically, learning how to look for whatever kernel of truth there may be in what your opponent is arguing, so that you can figure out the best argument against their view. And they understood the importance of a dissenting faculty member's voice let's hope that it's a symphony, not a cacophony of voices that one hears on a world-class university campus. So I guess what I'd say is that it is often the case that hearing dissenting voices has to be viewed as not inconvenient, but rather important to the actual mission of the institution, because that's how we prepare students to be great citizens, so that they hear, they understand, they can formulate positions, have critical views about things other than themselves. What we certainly want in a law school, and remember, I'm talking about graduate students whose median age is 24 and a half. We want them to be able to think critically. We want them to not have knee-jerk reactions to views that are different from their own. We want to instill in them a certain amount of humility, if not kind of self-examination with respect to their own views. We're lawyers, we're in the business of trying to make things complicated. That's how we earn a living. But as an intellectual matter, if there's a hard question and you think the answer is simple, then you're not thinking about it in a serious enough way.
Problem, Susan, jump in if you want, but I want to throw out Susan's idea that there should be limits in speech, that speech can harm. We're not talking about yelling fire in a theater. The insurrection may be the best example of speech. I believe you can draw a clear link from the speech to the insurrection. But the idea that speech can harm, is it a slippery slope? Anybody wants to jump in? Michael,
But I just kind of jump in and say, there's nothing wrong with the slippery slope. There's slippery slopes almost everywhere.
Yes.
The question is how you deal with that slope, how you deal with the subtleties in the distinctions. And I think part of this is, so I guess what I'm saying is that part of this is the question of what's the norm. But another part of it is when application of the norm is uncertain or disputed, what's the process by which a specific community works through its disagreements about application of the norm. And that is almost as important from the perspective of the mission and from the perspective of preparing students for the real world. That process part is almost as important as formulating the norm in the first case, because we're always going to have disagreements. The question is, how do we deal with them in a constructive way and in a way that's consistent with the mission of that institution?
Right.
But precisely, Susan, let me go to you, and I really do want everybody to jump in. It's when that recognition of the value of different opinions getting hashed out shifts over to trying to shut people down. And that's kind of where cancel culture takes this debate to an extreme. And again, it happens at a time. Tom Edsall in the New York Times today had an excellent, today, the day we're taping this, about the exhausted middle, watching these people argue from either side of the spectrum and saying, that's not where we live. It's when it goes to try to oust a John Yoo, to try to shut people up.
Yeah. And I want to jump in about the slippery slope argument, because I've been hearing this since the Skokie case in the 70s, when I was a kid. But that was when I first got interested in all of this, because there were cases where I think speech or threatened speech was actually harming people. And the courts view in that particular case was, well, look, if we prohibit neo-Nazis from marching down the street in Skokie, where there are lots of Holocaust survivors living, wearing their armbands and their uniforms, we might want to do that. We might think that's okay, right? But that's going to lead to a slippery slope. And at the bottom of the slippery slope is you always find Shakespeare, Merchant of Venice, or, I think that kind of threat is not one to be taken seriously in that particular way. Many other countries do have prohibitions on speech inciting racial hatred, or in Germany, Holocaust denial.
Liberal
They haven't, pardon?
liberal democracies, right?
They have not led to banning the Merchant of Venice, right? So I think there's some of those threats we don't need to take as seriously as we do. That said, I'm as concerned, I think, as Keith and anybody else on this panel about what you're calling cancel culture. I want to make sure it's known that the threats to academic freedom are coming from the right as well as from the left. And many of those on the right are using free speech arguments to try to silence academics, like weaponizing the First Amendment. So it gets very, very messy and very complicated. There were two cases just last Thursday that were reported on in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. There was one about the Boise State University that suspended a diversity class. They abruptly suspended 52 sections of a diversity and ethics course, citing concerns that a student or students were made to feel, quote, humiliated and degraded in class for their beliefs and values, end quote. And the evidence for this, the only evidence presented in this article, is given by Tony Rourke, the interim president, who told the Chronicle of Higher Ed the allegations were serious enough to suspend all of these classes. Quote, he said, quote, what we heard was a student in class was made to speak to issues that they apparently weren't comfortable speaking to, Rourke said. I mean, whether this is a student on the left or on the right, this, I think, is unacceptable in an academic environment, right? Students should know in our classes, especially if we're talking about controversial things like racism and sexism and classism, that it's not going to be easy. They're going to be uncomfortable conversations, right? I do think, though, sometimes things can go too far, and we do need to follow certain protocols. It's never the case that anything goes in a classroom. If I'm teaching a philosophy course and someone decides to start ranting about flat Earth, I'm totally within my rights to say, sorry, we're not talking about that. Right, so it's very different. The values of academic freedom are very different from those in play when we look at the First Amendment protection, free speech. Truth matters. I'm again totally within my rights to give an F to a, not that we ever do that anymore, but to a student who just, we don't even get C's, who completely gets something wrong, just states falsehood about a particular person's position. It's not everything is a matter of interpretation. In some Supreme Court cases, we say, well, under the First Amendment, there's no such thing as a false idea or a false opinion. In the classroom, you can be sure that there is.
And if I could, I gave a perhaps too antiseptic account of Smith, because it strikes me that, in fact, at Smith, a number of these strands came together. At Smith, and this is from talking with many, frankly, quite liberal faculty, there's a real concern now over a number of years, as I know has been true at a number of liberal arts schools, that there are things that, frankly, you in some cases shy away from teaching, that students have, are very quick to kind of go from, and not to blame it all on students, but to go from 0 to 80 in terms of, accusations of all sorts of things, gender, race, other things. There had been the case at Smith a couple years earlier of a class on Native American spirituality where the students had, put up posters denouncing this. The university or the college caved very quickly and simply allowed it to the class to be canceled. This was in fact by a young faculty member who had studied in precisely that area and whose mentor was a famous, Native American scholar herself. So that all of this sort of, if you will, kind of comes to roost in this case, and that the university, rather than, or the college president, rather than standing up and saying, no, we have certain procedures here. We're going to try to find out first whether this happened, and we take this seriously. We're going to go at it. Instead, there was this rush to immediately show, a rush to justice, right? Or in this case, injustice. And I think that's where I think my sense is that the different strands come together. Professors and often college presidents, I think, and maybe I'd put a special blame on college presidents, become leery of leading.
There's a sense in which this question applied to the college and university context is simpler than in the broader society. And I say that because for us, the idea of having disputes around ideas is central to our purpose. But as Susan brilliantly points out, it has to take place within a culture of truth, a truth seeking. And we have to have ways of trying to sort out what is true from what is not true. And we have an interest in helping our students learn how to sort out what is probably true from what is probably untrue. So I think one of the difficulties here is that, I think the decline of truth culture is far more important than the alleged rise of cancel culture.
But aren't they? In fact related? Let me grab Keaton. Isn't it the case that it's when that truth seeking becomes, to use Susan's words, weaponized, and you want to defeat the other side, and as we retreat to ideological silos,
That's right.
At middle, then everything becomes weaponized. Even Mr. Potato Head.
Look, they're all species of intolerance. They're all species of intolerance, as is kind of the rabid partisanship that we see. It's all, to me, part of this social moment that we and many other nations are going through at the moment. And there are lots of factors that we could talk about from the internet on, but it is all about intolerance. And intolerance is the enemy of education.
It would help if university leaders would be willing to articulate the kind of mission that Chris Fredley and Susan just articulated about what it is universities are for. He highlighted law schools in particular as being places where you want to be able to debate ideas and trying to train students to think seriously about ideas, confront the opposition, and think through arguments they disagree with. But really, that's true about the university on the whole. And what we see far too often are university leaders who are not willing to articulate that mission, not willing to stand up for that mission. So the quote that Susan read earlier from the president of Boise State is extraordinarily discouraging, right? As a representation of what it is we're trying to accomplish in universities, the possibility that a student might be made uncomfortable in the classroom by having to explore ideas that they don't like. Unfortunately, we see that kind of statement over and over again, lots of context. And maybe in this particular context, there's a factual situation and investigation that led him to think this happened in a fashion that's inappropriate. But that phrasing and that kind of concern that students shouldn't feel uncomfortable in the classroom, it's something's gone wrong. If students feel like they're experiencing ideas that they find difficult, is repeated far too often. We've seen it for well over 20 years now of university presidents articulating that. And as a consequence, students and parents come into universities not understanding what they're there for. Politicians don't understand what universities are there for. And as a consequence, they're all building expectations. They're completely wrong about what it is we ought to be doing. And we need to be able to articulate much more clearly this message that we're in the truth-seeking business, we're in the business of taking ideas seriously, and we're in the business of grappling with controversial, difficult ideas where you're going to encounter people who disagree with you and are going to push you hard on ideas that you find very disagreeable and offensive and wrong-headed in lots of ways. But that's what we're here for. And we need to defend that mission and that idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Bob's question. I don't think it's the pursuit of truth that's leading to cancel culture. It's other things. I mean, if you look at some of the most provocative people, I mean, I guess whatever happened to Milo Yiannopoulos, he just kind of disappeared. But when he was going around speaking on college campuses, he was not interested in having rational debate with people that would lead to the truth, right? There are other interests. And that's also true in general in the media, right? Facebook, Twitter, they're not out there to arrive at the truth. They're making money, right? So I think it's important to whether we're talking about free speech on the one hand or academic freedom, to step back and look at, well, what are the values that we think this thing is supposed to promote? I mean, I think in the US, we have kind of First Amendment ideology. When I want to really alienate my fellow country people, I say First Amendment fundamentalism. We're an outlier. Most other liberal countries, most every country that has any kind of free speech law or protection says, well, of course, it has to be restrained by other values, people's right to equality or right to dignity. Right? In the US, we haven't interpreted the right to free speech in that way. And so we have allowed, I think, a lot of harmful speech. But why? I mean, why? If you say, well, what makes speech so special? Once you acknowledge that it can cause serious harms, and if you have a view that many philosophers like myself have, that speech does things, right? Speech acts. And sometimes the things that it does are unjustly harmful. Right? Then we need to step back and say, well, why are we protecting this harmful speech? Especially if it brings about harms that if they were brought about by non-speech conduct, we would think the government would have a right to restrict it. Right? So, some people say, well, it's because we value the truth. Well, but some speech, obviously, all of the disinformation that's out there on the internet is certainly not leading to, it's not going to give us a greater chance of arriving at the truth in the long run. Likewise, if you're arguing for free speech from the value of democracy, in order to have a well-functioning democracy, everybody has to be able to get their views heard and has to be able to receive everybody else's views. Well, when you look at unregulated internet, I mean, that's not happening in very many cases, or the main other value that's invoked is the value of autonomy, whether that's self-fulfillment or moral autonomy or moral independence. If you've got speech that's violating the autonomy of targets of the speech, then you can't just invoke this ideal of autonomy to say, we just have to tolerate that. It's complicated.
Far be it from me to stop beating up on the academy, but these kinds of debates are taking place in the New York Times, which is kind of the Ivy Leagues of the media. I mean, there were people who criticized within the Times who criticized your story as not being helpful to the broader cause.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, no, and of course, I mean, look, I mean, all of these, I'm writing right now a piece on the ACLU, and what's fascinating there is that the ACLU is debating and battling out these same things, our preeminent civil rights organization, in the same way we are here, in the same way we are at the New York Times. I mean, none of these places are immune from the cultural storms. And I mean, we had a debate also at the Times over publishing an op-ed by a United States senator that a majority of my colleagues found, abhorrent. I disagreed with them. I thought that's what newspapers do. If a United States senator is going to publish, a right-wing senator is going to publish a provocative op-ed, and he's thinking about running for president in 2024, I'd say that's the very definition of an argument I want to hear now. But having said that, I'm not arguing. I'm not here to argue my point. It's just simply to say, of course, we're all, I think, any of us, and I'm sure you are, at CUNY. I mean, we're all in the middle of this storm right now.
I want to jump in to say, I really admire your article, and I don't know, I didn't read what the criticisms were coming from your colleagues, Michael. But I could imagine one criticism is if you just put that out there by itself and don't put it in the context of what, at least I see teaching at Dartmouth and sometimes at Princeton, that the Black students really are racially profiled a lot of the time, right? And if people thought this would be taken as sort of what's representative of how things are, that Black students who complain about what goes on, how they're profiled on these campuses, are just making it up all the time, then I could see why people would be upset about that. So I think it's important to put all of these stories in a larger context. I mean, that's hard to do, and time is limited, and life is short.
Stop whining unless there's a noose nailed to your dorm room door.
Right. Yes.
I will say that what Susan was saying before just helped me realize why I wasn't smart enough to major in philosophy in college and had to settle for mathematics. It is the context is all but a newspaper in one column in one news story can't provide all of that context. So it really, I think, in a way, goes to people having a healthy debate about what's the mission of the news organization, given the constraints of feasibility. I will say what I'm troubled with, and going back to the big picture, is it's now almost as though, in contrast to truth seeking, it's as though passion has been made equal to evidence, and the truthfulness of what the speaker said is gauged by the volume. And to the extent that that exists in any of our institutions, we're screwing up. I think that's the technical term. We're screwing up big time in disserving the public in profound ways that are corrosive.
Though I have to admit, I'm concerned that increasingly it's true in universities, and I think it's true in various other contexts as well. Certainly, I think it's true in our politics, is that it's not just that we have exchanged a concern with reason and argumentation for concern with emotion, and allowing emotion sometimes to trump other kinds of arguments for what's true, but also increasingly there is a concern about that we ought to be more focused on what value a particular truth claim might serve within a larger political project. So does it fit the narrative that we're trying to advance more generally? And if it's not, then we ought to suppress it and exclude it because it might be problematic for the larger political agenda we're trying to advance. That's extraordinarily corrosive for a university context, but really it's corrosive, I think, for the entire culture. If we're not willing to engage with those we disagree with, we're not willing to hear arguments that we find disagreeable, simply because we put a higher priority on advancing particular political projects we have than on actually engaging with what might be true about the world.
Yeah, but I think I agree with you completely, but that doesn't mean that there are some people in academia who don't have a political agenda. And then there are others,
Yes,
feminists like myself, critical race theorists, who do have an agenda. I mean, my own view is we all have agendas, and we should be upfront about that. And we should question these claims. I was just reading the Bari Weiss's blog about Jody Shaw's letter, the letter that the Smith employee who worked in the Department of Residential Life wrote, and when she resigned, saying she's been subjected to a racially hostile environment. She has been forced to discuss personal thoughts and feelings about her skin color, and that's unacceptable. She's been reduced to her skin color. People's worth as human beings and the degree to which they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect is, at Smith, determined by the color of their skin. I mean, she claims there's this toxic ideology. That's a claim too that has to be examined in context. I mean, everybody's claiming victim status.
Yes, and
But they're not always true. You have to look at the facts, look at the truth, look at them in context, in historical and contemporary cultural, political context.
But it's facts, but it's also, I think, it's comparisons. I mean, look, high school is, I want you to formulate an opinion about Nazis, neo-Nazis marching in Skokie. Right? College should be neo-Nazis march in Skokie. You have your opinion. Now, what do you think about civil rights marchers in the 60s or Black Lives Matter marchers today? How do you distinguish those cases? Do you feel the same way about them? Are there principled reasons to think differently about those different problems? That's college thinking, and that's what we ought to be shooting for, as well as, so it's that analytical thinking as well as the truth-seeking, commitment to truth-seeking.
let me jump in and ask Ernesto, as we have some questions from the students who are in the audience. Go ahead, Ernesto. How are you, sir?
Good. Thank you. The first question today from a student comes from Wayne Dawkins of York College. Is cancel culture, or another form of it, necessary at this particular time, and does it represent the best alternative in a social media-driven culture to address the issues that it intends to? What are the alternatives if they exist?
That's a nice small question.
Please come to law school. Please come to law school.
Question is, I mean, it's almost a question, you know, again, this is, you know, my theory has to do with the hollowing out of the middle and our intellectual and ideological silos where we can't agree on facts, let alone on what a solution is, which I happen to think President Biden is trying to bridge. I mean, he's trying to create a sense that, you know, you can actually talk to people that you disagree with. Is it inevitable? Is this kind of separation inevitable? I mean, Keith, you know, you're a conservative on a fairly liberal campus, as I understand it. Is there? I mean, does this kind? Are we doomed to not be able to find this common ground?
Look, I don't think we're doomed. If I thought we were doomed, I'd be in the wrong profession. It's hard to be in a profession in which I try to write books and teach classes and talk to people if I really believe that it's not possible to talk to people and persuade them of things. And I wouldn't bother trying to be involved in an organization like the Academic Freedom Alliance if I didn't think it was possible to recover some of these virtues and make our situation better. Part of what I struggle with, though, with a question like the one from the student is I have a very hard time identifying what people necessarily have in mind by cancel culture. It's an extraordinarily amorphous term. It includes a wide range of activities, some of which I think are quite problematic and others of which I think are quite reasonable. And so it depends a lot on what we're talking about. And so it often makes more sense to talk about these things in very specific contexts rather than with a very broad brush. So, for example, we mentioned a case that came up earlier with Milo Yiannopoulos. I think universities would have been much better off not inviting somebody like that to campus. The student groups that were inviting him were making a mistake for the most part and bringing him to campus precisely because he's a performer, he's not interested in truth seeking, he's not interested in engaging in arguments. It doesn't enlighten the campus in any fashion to bring somebody doing that particular shtick to campus. At the same time, having had students choose to invite him, I also think it was deeply problematic for other students to try to deplatform and prevent him from being heard such that they disrupt his activities, right? So if we think about cancel culture as the initial decision about who do you bring to campus and what kind of choices are you making, then, you know, I think we ought to quite reasonably be thinking those things through, and it's quite reasonable to criticize people for making bad choices when they make bad choices. On the other hand, what we think of as cancel culture is primarily this effort to prevent people from exercising their rights of being able to speak or to hear people speak that they want to listen to, then that's quite troubling. And we ought to try to restrict people and limit people's ability to engage in that kind of disruptive behavior. So it really depends a lot, I think, on what exactly we're concerned with. And like I said, I'm very frustrated by sort of the cancel culture discourse because it's very slippery and people seem to often want to move it onto more favorable grounds whenever they encounter criticisms they find hard to deal with.
I also think it's the part of the context here, though, I think should be issues of hierarchy. And it's one thing when a minority voice is being canceled by a majority voice, an otherwise kind of more powerful voice, and it's another when it's the opposite. I mean, I'm not saying that's dispositive, but I think that is a consideration that should factor into what extent a particular incident is of concern. If it's a majority voice trying to cancel, if it is a minority voice trying to cancel a majority voice, is the majority's voice really being canceled in the large? Or is it that the minority voice is trying to decrease the volume of the majority voice precisely because there is an imbalance in the truth-seeking process? I mean, I'm just raising, you can't divorce it seems to me, from the social context.
But boy, those are difficult judgments to make in particular context. So is John Yoo part of the majority voice or the opposite of being the majority voice?
Yeah.
Right? He's one of the very few conservatives in the Berkeley Law School, but he's part of a much larger political group that has a lot of influence and power, right? And so,
right. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, right.
Let me try to get one more question in, if I could. We're starting to run short on time. Ernesto?
The second question comes from David Kakureb of York College. Cancel culture is being seen as a form of censorship. When any form of censorship is present in a democracy, is it really a democracy?
Susan talks about limits on free speech. Free press is also part of that First Amendment. So, I mean, when you use speech as a tool, when you use the right of free speech as a tool, is that my slippery slope, or is it something more serious than that? How's that for your question? Yes.
I think that, look, I mean, my I guess my bias is that I think it is, we're richer universities when you have more speech. I completely agree that there are people, Milo is a good example, that who have a shtick. But I went to a state university in the 70s, and if we dismissed all the speakers who had a shtick, we would have had quite a few less speakers. And one person's shtick isn't, and I'm not even trying to be glib about this. I mean, I remember as a junior high school kid, buying a Black Panther newspaper that talked about, the cover was some variation on kill the pigs, and it had like a pig roast. I mean, that's, by any definition, that's pretty energetic speech. And you could certainly, if your father was a cop, you would see that as hate speech, right? At the same time, I mean, my personal value is, I'm glad there was a Black Panther newspaper. I'm glad, I mean, I guess I am revealing perhaps of my age and cultural place that I tend to see. I mean, I look at the fact that we differ from Europe as a glorious exception. And that isn't to wipe away. I understand that a lot of the recent jurisprudence on speech is arguably more towards, giving speech to the powerful, Citizens United. I mean, you can point to any number of things. But I think these are values really worth fighting for, because, it's not just the alt-right, it's the Black Panthers, and we could keep going. Anyway, so that's for what it's worth.
But Michael, does it trouble you that our institutions for figuring out what speech is truthful and what speech is lying, deceitful. I mean, it seems our ways of doing that are not as strong, our institutions for doing that are not as strong as they used to be. Should that cause us any recalibration of our views on this? I mean, look, part of my concern with these campus speakers is that sometimes they are propagandists, whether on the right or on the left, and I just don't see how that's helpful to my university. I mean, they can take their microphone someplace else, but it's not. Neither is helping my students or my university.
That's always been true.
I agree with you, and I don't, as I say, I don't mean to sound glib. I mean, I think when I say that there were speakers with shticks, that shtick actually is it's too easy. I mean, there are speakers, yes, that are deeply problematic, but I'm not sure. I mean, I know Milo, right? Milo came to Berkeley, right? And it became quite a cause celeb. So he kind of accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, probably better than if he had just gone off to some auditorium, spoken, and left. So
I feel differently if he'd been invited by the theater department.
I think that's an important distinction, though, in some ways, right? Because that there are different responsibilities for what the college Republicans are going to do, as opposed to what the Department of Political Science is going to do. You expect different judgments to be made about what kind of speakers to bring to campus. They speak with a different kind of platform, depending on those choices, and those are choices you need to be making. Universities are big, complicated places.
Let me interrupt because we have about 10 seconds to go. I'm an old print man. I'm terrible on this time stuff, but you don't argue with your surgeon, your car mechanic, or people who control the time. Thank you all for this. Was very, very spirited. I got a political theory degree at Rutgers, and then I drove a cab, but that's also a separate point. Thank you all. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
thank you.